What would you do if the man marrying your daughter looked her dead in the eye at the rehearsal dinner and told her, in front of 40 people, that her mother's toast had embarrassed him, and she laughed along with him? My name is Walter, and until that night, I thought I knew exactly who my daughter had become. The dinner had cost more than I made in my first 2 years running my hardware store. 40 guests filled the private room at the Magnolia Grill. Candles were lit down the center of every table. Wine was poured. People were laughing, catching up, admiring the flowers my wife Carol had spent 3 weeks arranging herself. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of the happiest week of our family's life. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, I had taken back the down payment on a lake house worth close to $400,000, pulled my daughter's name off the deed to my auto parts business, and walked out of that dinner while the entire room sat frozen in silence. One sentence stopped the toasts cold. One sentence made the groom's own mother set down her wine glass and stare at her son like she'd never seen him before. One sentence changed my daughter's future. But none of that happened because of what I said into that microphone. It happened because of what my daughter chose to do when her mother needed her most. Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat across a table from your own child and realized, in the space of about 4 seconds, that you no longer recognize them? Not the version standing in front of you, not the way they looked at you, because that's exactly what happened to me at a rehearsal dinner in front of people I'd known my entire life. Most people who hear this story assume the worst part was what he said to her. It wasn't. Words can be walked back. An apology, even a late one, can start to heal a wound like that. The real damage came from what happened 3 seconds later, from the choice my daughter made when she had every opportunity to stand up for her own mother and chose, instead, to laugh. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene in front of the groom's family. I finished my dinner. I excused myself calmly, and I made one phone call. And before that rehearsal dinner was over, that phone call would cost my daughter more than she had any idea was even possible. If stories about family loyalty and the moments that test it hit close to home for you, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing. And tell me down in the comments what state or country you're watching from tonight. Because what happened next, I promise you, nobody in that room saw coming. To understand why I made that phone call, you have to understand who my daughter used to be and what her mother and I built to give her the life she had. My wife Carol and I started with nothing. I mean that in the most literal way a person can mean it. 34 years ago, we opened a small auto parts store in a strip mall outside Dayton, Ohio, with a loan from Carol's uncle, 400 square feet of retail space, and a stack of unpaid bills that kept me up more nights than I'd like to admit. There were years, real years, not exaggerations, when Carol and I split a single sandwich for lunch because the register hadn't cleared enough to justify 2. I remember getting up before 5 most mornings to open the shop, and coming home after Carol had already put dinner away, my hands smelling like brake fluid no matter how many times I washed them. Carol did the books at our kitchen table every night after her shift at the dental office, a calculator in one hand and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier in the other. We didn't take vacations. We took inventory. The whole reason we did any of it, every 16-hour day, every skipped vacation, every argument about whether we could afford new brake pads for our own family car, was so our daughter, Rebecca, would never have to live the way we did when we were starting out. And she didn't. Rebecca never wondered whether the lights would stay on. She never had a single school trip she couldn't go on because of money. When she wanted to try gymnastics, then dance, then the debate team, we said yes every time, and we meant it every time, because that was the whole point of everything Carol and I had sacrificed. Some of my favorite memories in this life come from those years. Sitting in a folding chair at her dance recitals, watching her mother French braid her hair before a competition at 6 in the morning, watching her face when I handed her the keys to a used Honda Civic on her 17th birthday, she cried. And so did I. And I wasn't even a little bit ashamed of that. When it came time for college, Carol and I paid every semester in full. No loans, no gaps. Because we wanted her focused on becoming whoever she was going to become, not worrying about debt the way we had. For a long time, I believed all of that meant something to her. I believed she understood exactly where her comfortable life had come from. Looking back now, I wonder if Carol and I made the mistake so many parents make. We worked so hard to make sure she never had to struggle, that she never learned what struggle actually teaches a person. It didn't happen all at once. These things rarely do. It started small enough that I could talk myself out of noticing it. A comment here. An eye roll there. Little moments I chalked up to her being tired, or busy, or just going through something. And then, she met Grant. When Rebecca brought Grant home the first time, I understood immediately what she saw in him. He was sharp, well-spoken, the kind of young man who shook your hand a little too firmly and looked you dead in the eye like he'd read a book about how to make a good first impression and executed it perfectly. The first few dinners he was pleasant enough. He asked about the store. He complimented Carol's cooking. He laughed at my jokes, even the bad ones. Nothing seemed out of place. At least, not at first. The first real warning sign came on a Sunday. We'd taken Grant and Rebecca to Delfino's, a little family-run Italian place Carol and I had been going to since before Rebecca was born. We'd celebrated her graduations there, her 21st birthday. Carol's 50th. It wasn't fancy. It was ours. Halfway through the meal, Grant glanced around at the checkered tablecloths and the faded photographs on the wall and asked, loud enough for the table next to us to hear, "Do people actually still eat at places like this?" He said it with a little laugh, like it was harmless. Rebecca laughed too. I noticed. Carol noticed. Neither of them noticed us noticing. A few months later, at a company picnic for the dealership Grant worked at, I watched him snap his fingers at a teenage server because his lemonade wasn't refilled fast enough. When an older man accidentally bumped his elbow reaching for a napkin, Grant looked at him the way you'd look at something you'd stepped in. The man apologized twice. Grant didn't say a word back to him. But the moment that really stuck with me happened at Carol's sister's house, over a 4th of July cookout. Carol was in the middle of telling a story, one she'd told 100 times, one everybody in that family loved, when Grant cut her off mid-sentence. "That's not actually how that happened," he said flatly, in front of 12 people. It wasn't true. It wasn't even close to true. And it wasn't necessary. Carol laughed it off, the way she laughed everything off. I didn't laugh. As the engagement moved forward, it became harder and harder to ignore how much Grant's, and increasingly, Rebecca's expectations had shifted. Every dinner had to be somewhere impressive enough to post about. Every gift had to say something about status. When Carol suggested doing the wedding at the same event hall where my own brother had gotten married 30 years earlier, Rebecca laughed and said, "Mom, we're not doing this at a Knights of Columbus hall." What worried me more than any of that, though, was watching my daughter change right alongside him. The girl who used to help me restock shelves on Saturday mornings started introducing me differently at parties. It used to be, "This is my dad. He owns Reynolds Auto Parts." Now it was, "This is my dad. He's got like a car parts thing." The words weren't cruel. The tone underneath them was. So when Grant and Rebecca asked us to cover the deposit on a lake house near Put-in Bay as an early wedding gift, something to start their life together the right way, we said yes. When the venue costs went up by $20,000 because Rebecca wanted a specific tent company flown in from Chicago, we said yes to that too. Every single time, I told myself it was just wedding stress. I told myself things would settle once the ceremony was behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the easy night. No pressure, no ceremony, just family and close friends getting to know each other the night before the wedding. Carol had planned every detail of it herself, the flowers, the seating chart, even a small toast she'd written and rewritten probably a dozen times, because she wanted it to be perfect for her only daughter. Dinner went smoothly enough. Wine was poured, plates were cleared, and eventually the wedding coordinator nodded toward Carol that it was time for her toast. My wife stood up, a little nervous, holding a folded index card in her hand, and began to speak about the little girl she used to braid ribbons into for dance recitals, about watching her grow into a woman she was proud of. Partway through, her voice caught. She'd written something about Rebecca's grandmother, who'd passed the year before, and it clearly hit her harder than she expected in the moment. She paused to collect herself. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. That's when Grant, sitting at the head table with a champagne glass in his hand, leaned toward Rebecca and said, not quietly, not privately, but loud enough for at least 15 people around us to hear, "Is she going to pull it together, or are we doing this all night?" A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the room. Carol froze mid-sentence. Her cheeks went red. And then I watched my daughter, put her hand over her mouth and laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward laugh she couldn't help. A real one. The kind of laugh you give when you agree with what was just said. I want you to understand something. Carol didn't fall in the mud. Nobody shoved her. Nobody touched her. What happened to my wife that night was smaller than that, and quieter than that, and somehow it hurt more, because it happened in front of everyone we knew, and the person who was supposed to protect her thought it was funny. Carol finished the toast. She's always been like that. She'll swallow her own pain rather than make anyone uncomfortable. She raised her glass, said something about loving them both, and sat down. Her hands were shaking. I reached over and took one of them under the table. I looked at Rebecca. I don't know what I expected. Embarrassment maybe, some flicker of realizing what had just happened to her own mother. Instead, she leaned into Grant's shoulder and whispered something that made him smile. If someone spoke to your mother that way, at her own daughter's wedding dinner, and your child laughed along with them, what would you do? I'd really like to know. Tell me down below. I sat there for the rest of dinner, and I want to be honest with you, I don't remember a single word anyone said for the next 20 minutes. I remember the sound of forks against plates. I remember Carol picking at her food, not really eating it, her eyes fixed somewhere on the tablecloth. I remember thinking about every small warning sign I had talked myself out of over the past 2 years, and how they weren't small anymore. They were the whole picture. I just hadn't wanted to see it. When dinner ended and people began mingling with coffee and dessert, I quietly excused myself and stepped outside into the parking lot. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in almost a year, Daniel Hartwell, our family attorney, a man who'd known Carol and me since before Rebecca was born, who'd handled the paperwork when we bought the store's building, who knew exactly how much Carol and I had sacrificed to get to where we were. He picked up on the third ring. "Walter, everything okay?" I didn't answer right away. I stood there in that parking lot, looking back through the restaurant windows at the warm light, at my daughter laughing with people she'd known for less than 2 years, while her mother sat quietly, trying not to cry in front of strangers. "No," I finally said. "It's not." I told him what happened. Not every detail, just enough. The toast. What Grant said. The laugh. There was a pause on the line. Daniel had known Rebecca since she was in diapers. "What do you want to do?" he asked. And that's when I remembered something Grant and Rebecca didn't know I remembered. 6 months earlier, Carol and I had put down a deposit $60,000 on a lake house near Put-in Bay as an early wedding gift, the kind of thing young couples dream about, a place to start their life together without a mortgage hanging over them for the first 10 years. The closing wasn't finalized. The title hadn't transferred. Legally, as of that moment, standing in that parking lot, the deposit and the property agreement were entirely mine to walk away from. "Stop the closing," I told Daniel. "All of it. Tell the seller we're pulling out and I want our deposit back. Every dollar we're entitled to." He didn't hesitate. "I'll have it done by Monday." I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly, for the first time since I'd watched my daughter laugh at her mother's pain. But I wasn't finished. There was one more thing. 3 years earlier, when Rebecca graduated college, Carol and I had added her name to 20% ownership of Reynolds Auto Parts, not because she'd earned it yet, but because we wanted her to have a stake in the family business, something to grow into, something that would be hers eventually if she wanted it. "I want her removed from ownership," I told Daniel. "Effective immediately. Draft whatever you need me to sign." "Walter," he said carefully, "that's a significant step. Are you sure?" I looked back through those restaurant windows one more time. Rebecca was laughing again, her head tilted back, completely unaware that anything in her life had just changed. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. As the call ended, one thought settled over me, with total clarity. I had spent 2 years quietly funding a version of my daughter's life that had no room left in it for basic respect toward her own mother. That funding had just ended. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and walked back inside. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. When I stepped back into that private dining room, nothing had changed. Coffee was being poured. Someone's cousin was telling a story about the bachelor party. The DJ hired for the rehearsal dinner, Grant's idea, of course, was quietly setting up in the corner for a surprise set of dancing later. It was as though what had happened to Carol 10 minutes earlier had already been forgotten by everyone except the two of us. I found Carol near the back of the room, sitting a little apart from the crowd, a cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched. She looked up at me, and I think she knew, just from my face, that I had made a decision. A few minutes later, the wedding coordinator, a kind woman named Priya, who'd been helping run the evening, stepped up near the small portable speaker system, the venue used for toasts, and tapped the microphone gently. If I could have everyone's attention, I believe the father of the bride would like to say a few words. I hadn't told her that, but Daniel had called ahead, quietly, to let the venue coordinator know I'd be adding something to the evening. I stood, and I felt 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me, warm, expectant, assuming they were about to hear a sentimental toast to close out the night. Each step toward that microphone felt strangely steady, not angry, not shaking, certain, in a way I hadn't felt about anything in a long time. At the head table, Grant looked pleased with himself, leaning back in his chair with his arm draped over the back of Rebecca's seat. Rebecca smiled up at me, expecting, I'm sure, some version of the toast her mother had just given proud father, misty-eyed, a few jokes about the groom. I picked up the microphone and looked around the room. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began. A few people nodded warmly, raised their glasses slightly, ready for the toast to begin properly. I've spent most of my life believing that family means showing up for each other, especially in the moments when it's hardest, I continued. The room stayed quiet, comfortable, still assuming they knew where this was going. For 34 years, my wife and I built something out of nothing so our daughter would never have to struggle the way we did. A few more nods. Someone's aunt smiled at Carol. Some of you know that 6 months ago, Carol and I put a deposit on a lake house as an early wedding gift for Rebecca and Grant. A ripple of pleasant surprise moved through the room. Rebecca's face lit up. She clearly hadn't expected me to mention it publicly, and for a moment, she looked genuinely touched. Then I said the next sentence. That gift is no longer happening. The room went completely still. I heard someone's fork clink softly against a plate. Grant's smile faltered, just slightly, like he thought he'd misheard me. I didn't stop. Tonight, during my wife's toast, the toast she wrote by hand about her own mother, who passed away last year, Grant made a comment loud enough for half this room to hear, mocking her for pausing to collect herself. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Grant's mother, sitting 2 seats down from him, turned her head slowly toward her son. And my daughter, I said. And here my voice caught, just for a second, the only moment all night it did, laughed. Rebecca's face changed completely. The color drained out of it in real time. Grant sat frozen, his jaw tight. Because respect isn't optional in this family, I continued. The deposit on that lake house has already been withdrawn as of tonight. It will not be reinstated. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Someone whispered something to the person next to them. And effective this morning, Rebecca's ownership stake in Reynolds Auto Parts, 20% of a company her mother and I built from nothing, has also been removed. The silence that followed was the kind you could physically feel pressing against your chest. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Chairs didn't even creak. But the reaction that stayed with me longest came from Grant's mother, Linda. She set her wine glass down slowly, deliberately, and looked at her son the way you look at someone you're seeing clearly for the very first time. She understood, in that moment, exactly what her son had done, and exactly what it had cost. If a story about a parent finally drawing a line means something to you, please consider subscribing. I've got more of these coming, and I promise you the next one hits just as hard. Across the table, Rebecca's confidence had completely disappeared. Her eyes moved from me to Grant and back again, searching for something, an out, An explanation, someone to fix what had just happened. Nobody offered one. There was nothing left to argue. Grant pushed his chair back and stood up fast enough that it scraped loudly against the floor. His face was red. "Walter, you can't just—" I raised one hand. Not to threaten him, just to stop him, because I had absolutely no interest in whatever he was about to say. Not after what I'd watched him do to my wife 20 minutes earlier. Not after 2 years of small warnings I'd chosen to ignore. He took one step toward the little speaker stand. I reached over and simply switched off the microphone. The soft click was the loudest thing in the room. That conversation was not going to happen on his terms. I set the microphone down, stepped away from the front of the room, and walked straight to my wife. The entire room seemed to hold its breath watching me do it. I reached Carol's chair, held out my hand, and she took it without a word. Together, we walked toward the door. No scene, no last words for Rebecca, no argument in front of 40 guests. Just two people choosing to leave with whatever dignity we had left in that room. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt something lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 2 years. Looking back on it now, I don't think I lost a daughter that night. I think I lost the version of her I'd been imagining, the one who still existed mostly in old photographs and dance recital videos and a Honda Civic with a bow on it. The woman sitting at that head table, laughing while her mother sat quietly, wounded beside her, was someone else entirely. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that money and comfort can build a lot of things. They can build houses. They can build a business. They can pay for weddings with flown-in tents from Chicago. What they cannot build is character. Character shows up in the moments nobody expects to be tested at a rehearsal dinner, over a toast, in the 4 seconds it takes to decide whether to defend your own mother or laugh along with the person who's humiliating her. So let me ask you the same thing I've been asking myself every night since. Did I go too far, pulling that gift and that ownership stake the same night it happened? Or did my daughter earn every bit of that consequence the moment she chose to laugh? I'd really like to hear what you think. Let me know down below, and thank you, truly, for sitting through this one with me tonight.